Okay, fine. I read A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. A couple of months ago, I put out a video talking about Sunrise on the Reaping and all of my issues with that book, and a lot of people in the comments told me that I should read A Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the first prequel book in the Hunger Games series, which focuses on Coriolanus Snow, who eventually becomes President Snow, and the first ever District 12 victor of the 10th Hunger Games, Lucy Gray Baird. Some people were saying I should read it because they agreed that Sunrise on the Reaping was not a very good book, and they said that they actually liked Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes better. Some people told me I should read it because I made some comments about how I didn't like how the fandom treated Lucy Gray Baird and how I thought she was a bad addition to the lore because of how the fandom uses her to explain everything, and they felt that I shouldn't be having an opinion on this character without having read the book that she is from. So I went ahead and I read the book, and my opinion hasn't changed, but we'll get to that in a minute, because I actually agree with the people who read the book and liked it better than Sunrise on the Reaping. Not entirely, but a little bit, because I did actually like it better than Sunrise on the Reaping. Now, there were still issues that I had with it, but overall, I do think that it was a better book, and I'll talk a little bit about what I liked about it first. So first off, I like that this book is in the third person. All the other Hunger Games books are all written in first person. They're all in the perspective of Katniss or as Haymitch, and I like that this is in the third person for a couple of reasons. Number one, it puts a separation between this tyrant and the audience, and I think that's so important, because I was a little bit worried about the fact that this focuses on the dictator of Panem, and we're supposed to be reading from his perspective and relating to him. Like, I was a bit concerned about that. So seeing it was written in the first person, I think allows us to still follow his story, follow his perspective, while also putting a little bit of distance between us. I also think it works really well with Coriolanus' character, because he doesn't really let anyone into what he's thinking, so why would he let the audience into his head as well? The other thing I really liked about this that I think was one of my biggest issues with Sunrise on the Reaping is that this book actually explores some new ideas. My biggest problem with Sunrise on the Reaping was that it didn't add anything to the conversation, but this one actually introduced some new ideas. The idea of looking at capital children, how they feel about the Hunger Games, looking at those who actually experienced the war. We've been so separated from the dark days and the original rebellion that we haven't really gotten to see how experiencing that firsthand would lead to something like the Hunger Games and would lead to the feeling of this being okay and normal. And then also the idea of these district traitors who are social climbing and getting to the capital, and that specifically with Sejanus, who was from District 2, how he feels like he's betrayed his people, how he's desperate to kind of hold on to the traditions and the customs from his district, how he doesn't really fit in with either the tributes or the people in the capital. I thought that it was all a really, really interesting concept, and it was really well explored. Another thing I liked about this, which was another big problem for Sunrise on the Reaping, was the lack of fan service. I don't think that was necessarily a choice, but rather more of a circumstance of when it's set. Most of the characters from the original Hunger Games books are not even born yet, so obviously we can't have them show up. There's still a little bit of fan service. A lot of it has more to do with, here are some moments of like how things from the Hunger Games, like the interviews and the sponsorships and the mentors and how that all came to be. But because it doesn't all happen like all at once, it still does feel more natural. There was still a couple of other small fan service things, which we'll get to, that I wasn't a huge fan of, and let's actually start with that and dive into what I didn't like about the book. And first one is Tigress being Tigress. There was no reason for her to be Tigress. You could have chosen any other name and I wouldn't have an issue with it, because the character is actually fairly interesting and she opens up some interesting conversations about what is required for the survival during a war. I do like her character, but the fact that she is Tigress from the original books just ends up diminishing her appearance in the original books. It doesn't really add anything. It doesn't really add that complexity, because basically what we're saying now is that what we thought was this random capital lady who was willing to put herself at risk for the greater good of society now has a personal stake in this because it's her cousin. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, so I'll get back to that. But isn't it more interesting, the idea that this one small act of rebellion from a random person has such a big impact, rather than this is someone who is personally connected to the president? My second issue has a lot to do with the characterization of Coriolanus. And first and foremost is that I don't think the way that he feels about the tributes makes any sort of sense for what we know about him as a character. And I'm not just talking about what we know about him as President Snow. What we are told about him in this book does not line up with how he feels about the tributes. It's really interesting watching him interact with his fellow classmates, the way that he manipulates them, the way that Sejanus clearly thinks they're friends and he just sort of uses them but isn't really honest about his own feelings to himself. He doesn't really have any strong feelings towards the tributes. There is this apathy towards them, and what we know about his backstory does not line up with that making sense. It makes sense for a capital member to, or capital citizen I guess, to feel apathy towards the tributes during Katniss's games or even during Hamish's games, because they are so far removed from the war that they would have no memory of the violence that the rebels perpetrated, or at least the violence that is sort of propagated through propaganda. They only have hearsay at that point, and for them, the Hunger Games have been going on their whole lives, so it's just sort of a normal thing. It makes sense that they'd be apathetic towards it. But we know what Coriolanus went through during the war. We hear about how people in the capital were starving, about how their own neighborhood was bombed, about how some people ate pets or allegedly resorted to cannibalism to eat, how he lost his parents, his father dying in the war to a rebel sniper, how he lost all their money because it was all in District 13, how they lost all of their status, and how Tigris, who is not that much older than Snow, who was a minor, so Tigris was a minor as well, during the war, likely had to trade her body just for their survival. And that is all devastating things. I would expect him to feel some way about the tributes, about the fact that the children of the rebels, the children of the districts who might not have even been rebels but were just sort of a part of this, are now being punished for the actions of their parents. Either I would expect him to be angry. He would be so angry about everything that they've lost that he would want them to suffer. Or I would expect him to be sympathetic towards them because he knows what it's like to be a child who is suffering because of the choices of adults. And I'm not saying he has to be completely on board with the Hunger Games or completely against the Hunger Games. That's not what I'm saying. I think it can be complex, but he doesn't really have any sort of feelings for how the tributes are used in the Hunger Games. Another time that this doesn't really make sense is that Coriolanus does not really experience growth that feels natural or growth that makes sense for who we know that he will become. Because the Snow that we know from the original trilogy is not apathetic towards the tributes. He is terrifying and manipulative and conniving, and he is not against mutts. In fact, he is so for mutts that he's so willing to use mutts that will physically and psychologically harm the tributes. So how does he go from being passive and apathetic towards them to being actively hateful and manipulative and cruel to them? I really thought that there would be some natural progression. And we also see this with his relationship with Lucy Gray, where it starts off as being clearly attracted and, in his own words, not understanding why he has this care and affection for her, which leads me to believe that it is true care and affection in his eyes. I think it is still quite twisted by a healthy relationship standards, but he's questioning why he feels this for her, which makes me think that it is genuine on his part, no matter how twisted it may be to us. But how do we get from that to him being isolated, him being violent, him being hateful towards the district? And there just are many opportunities where I thought, oh, this is where we're going to start to see a shift. And they just weren't there. The first one is when he rescues Sejanus from the arena and he gets attacked by the tributes. And they point out to him afterwards, his teachers point out that they didn't have to attack him. Like, they get nothing out of attacking him. It wouldn't have even been shown on the screen. Like, there was nothing that would have gotten from that. They just attacked him because they hated him. And he makes a comment about the fact that they are like animals and that they're violent and crazy like animals. And I thought, oh, this is where we start to see it, where he's going to shift from being sort of apathetic towards the other tributes and start to actually see them as deserving of the violence and punishment. I also remember the review that I talked about in my previous video, the one that had talked about how it wasn't a very good book. They had talked about how they had kind of expected to see more of him being corrupted by the adults around him. And that is how we kind of got to see his downfall, how he, starts off as maybe well-meaning, but then kind of gets taken under the wing of these other adults who are, do not have his best interest at heart, but end up just sort of, making him not a great guy. And I was expecting that too. He doesn't like the mutts, but now we see in the original Hunger Games series how much he uses them, which clearly means he's fine with using them eventually. And I would have found it interesting to see him being groomed a bit more by Professor Gall. And we don't really see that. Like, we do see her, getting him to write a paper about what he liked about the war and forcing him to put his hand into the snakes. But we don't really see her taking him under her wing until the last chapter of the book, when he comes back and suddenly it's just the most interesting part about who this character would be is the part that gets cut off. And I do feel a little bit annoying about complaining about this, because one of my big complaints with Sunrise on the Reaping was that it was taking all this growth that would have happened over multiple years and trying to shove it into this one week of his life, which doesn't make sense. And while I do feel that this book cuts out a lot of the most interesting things that obviously would take years to occur, we're just not really seeing that change in the moment. It really felt like sometimes she forgot that this was meant to be snow. And instead of actually seeing that progression, which I think would have been more interesting, focusing on this one moment ended up being detrimental to the story. Another big moment that I think would have been a great time to see some change was when Coriolanus goes to District 12. And at this point, I want to talk a little bit about the ending of the book. I did not like the ending where he suddenly decides to attack Lucy Gray. It felt very out of nowhere, and it didn't really feel like there was a good lead up to it. And yes, it could be out of nowhere and still be effective, but it needs to have some sort of lead up, and this just didn't have that. I mean, even right before he attacks her, he is saying she wouldn't, betray me. She can't betray me. And he makes a good point. She really can't, and he knows that. Because if she says that he's the one who killed Billy Tope, then she puts herself at the scene of the murder, a murder that she is already being suspected of, that she is fleeing the district to avoid being punished for, and no one would believe her. That's the other thing. Who would believe her word over his when she's already being suspected of this death? And I think that his arrival in District 12 would have been a really great moment to show some cracks in their relationship, a little bit of build up to what we would see as being inevitable, of being his attack on her. I mean, we know that he still sees her as less than him. He talks about how she is district, so she is less than human, but she is better than the other District 12 people because she is able to be like a capital person. Maybe when he gets to District 12, he sees her acting like the other people, or he sees that the other people at District 12 act like her. And instead of that being humanizing for the other people of District 12 and him realizing maybe they're not as bad as I thought they were, maybe that makes him see that she is not special. And he begins to think, you know what, she's actually just like everyone else who's here. Maybe when she performs, he starts reading into these performances. It's sort of like performance flirting that she does. And he starts to get jealous over that, thinking that she's cheating on him. Maybe he trusts the word of a man like Billy Tope over her own word. And she tells her version of the story where she was cheated on, and Billy Tope tells his own where she's just crazy. And he takes the word of this man that he's never met before over the woman that is in front of her. That would also be a really interesting investigation. Maybe he sees that she acts differently in District 12 than she does in the Capitol, and he starts to think that maybe she's been manipulating not just the cameras, but also him the entire time. Those would be some really interesting ways to show little moments of change that slowly progress and have some growth, I suppose negative growth, in their relationship, or decay, I guess, is negative growth, which would help to lead up to the ending and make it a lot more clear. There are moments where he starts to get a little bit jealous, or he starts to see these cracks in this idealized version of her that he sees, but they're very small and they don't last for a long time, and then we move on like nothing happened. It's similar for that moment where he goes into the arena. There's a split moment where he starts to say, oh yeah, you know, they're like animals, and I think, great, this is where we're going to see some progression of this character into the more twisted character that we know. But instead, we just move on, and it's like it never happened. Okay, let's move on to Lucy Gray. And if you came here from my previous video, this is, I'm sure, what you wanted to hear. What are my thoughts on Lucy Gray after having read this book? Because I said something pretty controversial about Lucy Gray in my last video. I truly think that Snow's relationship with Lucy Gray Baird was the worst thing that Suzanne Collins has ever added to the lore of the Hunger Games. And I have to say, after reading this book and after seeing Lucy Gray for myself, I stand by what I said. And I mainly stand by because my issue with Lucy Gray has less to do with who she is as a character and more to do with the way the fandom treats her. The fandom has decided that pretty much everything that happens in the original trilogy can be linked back to something that Lucy Gray has done or something about her relationship with Snow. That's insane, and also oversimplifies a lot of the really complex themes in the original series. I was on social media a few days ago and I saw this post where someone took the moment from the movies where Snow says he will not refer to the rebellion as rebels, and someone matched that with the moment from Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes where they first meet and Lucy Gray calls him a rebel. And seeing someone say, oh, he doesn't want to call them rebels because it reminds him of her, is so crazy and diminishing to the significance of that line. The Hunger Games is all about propaganda. It is all about the significance that the power of media has and how that is used by big governments to try and paint the story the way they want. And words are important for that. And the reason he doesn't want to call them rebels is because a rebel implies there's something to rebel against, that there's some sort of injustice there. By calling the group something else, revolutionaries, terrorists, instigators, those words all have a connotation of violence, a connotation of unreasonable actions. And so by calling them something like that, he can control the narrative. They're not rebelling against something unjust. They are causing violence. They are causing chaos. It is not due chaos that is in response to something he has done. It is something that they are choosing to do. See how much analysis that I was able to get out of that one small line? But if we instead look at that line as just, well, he doesn't want to say rebels because that's what Lucy Gray called him, that is so much less interesting. Look, I have no issue with the idea of a character haunting the narrative, and sometimes it can be really effective and a really interesting storytelling technique, but this is not the book for that, because haunting the narrative will work to add complexity to a narrative that maybe doesn't have a lot of complexity to it, or a narrative that needs some complexity added to explain some of the details that are there. But all the details that Lucy Gray's connection to snow explains are things we don't need explanations for because we already got them in the original series. Let's go into some of those examples. The first one is the mockingjays. The mockingjay as a symbol for Katniss's rebellion is something that feels really tied to her. And that was something that I found even with Haymitch and Haymitch's rebellion, is that his rebellion wasn't really tied to the symbol of the mockingjay. Even though he had that mockingjay and snake striker, it didn't really feel like it was fully tied to that symbol. The Mockingjay pin also originally comes from a character named Madge Undersea, a character who doesn't exist in the movies. She is the mayor's daughter, a girl that Katniss doesn't even consider to be a friend, and yet she is the one who gives Katniss the Mockingjay pin. She is the one who puts the image of the Mockingjay into the rebellion itself, the image that Katniss will eventually embody. I think that's beautiful. Another moment of small rebellion is the song The Hanging Tree. This is another moment that the movie ruins. In the original book, the Hanging Tree is this folk song that the children of District 12 sing, and it's this song that is sung in this short moment of downtime as they're on their way to the capital. And it's this small moment, and it shows how music can be a form of rebellion, how folk songs can be a form of rebellion. And that is something that this book explores, and I actually did like that theme that we explore through Lucy Gray's use of music as a form of rebellion. But the problem is that the movie also, like the removal of Madge Undersea, takes this from a small act of rebellion and tells you that it's only useful if it's part of a big act of rebellion. I watched a video a while back, and I can't remember what it was called or who made it, so if you know what I'm talking about, please let me know. But it was a video that talked about the Hanging Tree as a song, and how in the book it's this moment of quiet rebellion, but in the film they kind of made it big and cinematic. And they talked about how the original Hunger Games movie was a little bit more down to earth, a little bit more grounded. But as it became a commercial success and each movie increased in its funding and the audience that it expected, the movies got more and more cinematic and less grounded and interested in exploring the themes of rebellion and rebelling against tyranny and totalitarianism that the books explore. And they use the Hanging Tree as an example of this because in the Mockingjay movie, when the Hanging Tree is sung, it's not a quiet moment. It becomes this big orchestral song as we watch people marching into battle. And that changes what that song means. Both the Mockingjay and the Hanging Tree are tied to Lucy Gray. Lucy Gray is the one who introduces Snow to the concept of mockingjays. She introduces him with her little saying about mockingjays. He even says the phrase, Lucy Gray's mockingjays at one point. And she's the one who wrote The Hanging Tree. And by tying these moments back to her, it makes Katniss's rebellion and the small acts of rebellion by District 12 and by Madge Undersea less significant, because originally those acts of rebellion were showing that you don't have to be a big leader, you don't have to make a huge impact, you don't have to have an in with the government in order to make a difference. Even something as simple as having a symbol of the foolishness of the totalitarian regime can be enough to make a huge difference. That can be enough to set something in motion. You don't have to have a huge impact as long as your small drop can make a huge ripple. But by tying that back to Lucy Gray, that takes that power away from those people. That tells you what you do doesn't matter unless someone else has already been there. Snow didn't need Lucy Gray to introduce him to mockingjays. I wouldn't have even had an issue with the appearance of mockingjays if it was just at the end of the book when he is, capturing them. That would be a way for him to learn about mockingjays, and I wouldn't have an issue with that. And I don't think it's needed because I think we get an explanation for why mockingjays are a symbol of the rebellion anyways, but I wouldn't have an issue with him finding out what mockingjays are in this book. I also wouldn't have an issue with seeing the moment from the hanging tree. It would feel a little bit like fan service, but it would be an interesting idea of, look, this is the actual moment that inspired the song. But the fact that he hears Lucy Gray singing it makes it different. Now, every time he sees the Mockingjay pin, he's not just thinking, oh, this is a symbol of the failure and the foolishness of the Capitol. Every time he hears the hanging tree, it isn't just, oh, look at the way that District 12 has embraced the sadness and cruelty and found a way to turn it into strength through music. He's looking at that symbol and hearing that song, and instead he is thinking of those moments with Lucy Gray. And that just gets rid of all of that complexity that comes from those symbols standing on their own 2 feet. And that is my issue with the way that the fandom treats those things, because what I just described is exactly how the fandom treats the original books from now on. And I think a lot of people are familiar with the Hunger Games not from reading the books first, but from watching the movies first. And I think that is also a problem because while the movies are good, well, the first couple are, but while the first couple movies are good, they do still get rid of a lot of the complex themes and dark moments from the book that are so significant that you so miss out on if you haven't read them. And my issue actually went further after reading this book, because originally I was only upset with the way the fandom was treating Lucy Gray, that they were taking everything she did to explain everything from the original trilogy, basically taking away the agency and rebellion of every single character who had small acts of rebellion, as well as from Katniss herself, but this book actually encourages it. So that makes me more upset because she was doing it intentionally. There's even a moment where she points out Katniss growing on the side of the lake. There's no reason for that. That didn't have to be Katniss. We did that because just to say, hey, look, the name Katniss is here. Katniss can't even have her own name be something that stands on its own 2 feet. It has to be something that is tied back to Lucy Gray, and that is my issue with her inclusion in the lore. Lucy Gray herself, I don't have a problem with. I think Lucy Gray is an interesting character. I think she's an interesting concept, but I don't think she is well executed. My main issue is that she just does not ever do anything wrong. Katniss was interesting because she's kind of not really a likable protagonist. She kind of expects the worst from everybody. She's not a reliable narrator. Haymitch is also not a perfect character because he can sometimes act like a bit of a coward, or he can act a bit selfish. And so those are interesting characters because it's interesting to look at characters who have some flaws. But Lucy Gray, we don't get to see that. Even when she is in the arena, her kills are self-defense or a kindness, or they are kind of far removed, so they're not like up close and personal like the poison that she leaves. Now, you could argue that this is intentional, and I think there are 2 paths you could take with seeing this as intentional. And that is first, that she is the idealized version of a girl that we see through Coriolanus's eyes. She is his manic pixie dream girl. He's choosing to see her a certain way and not see her complexity. And I do think that that was one of her goals. Another thing you could argue is that she's meant to be the idea of the perfect victim. If you're not familiar with the concept of the perfect victim, it's basically this myth that in order to be worthy of sympathy, a victim of some sort of attack or abuse or violence must have acted perfectly. They must not have done anything wrong. And this is often tied to misogyny, but it's not always specifically directed to women, even though it is majority directed towards women. But it's why you see a lot of victim blaming. Questions of, well, were you kind to this person? What were you wearing? Were you walking this place at night? And the problem is that I just don't think that these ideas are executed very well. I can see that this might have been what she was intending, but they're not executed well. And the problem is that when you try to execute commentary on a specific idea, but don't do it very well, all you're doing is emulating the idea you tried to comment on. I think there would be a way to show her as the embodiment of the perfect victim and how the idea of the perfect victim is unrealistic because she still gets attacked in the end, while actually showing the audience that she's not perfect. But the only real examples that we get of this is her putting the snake down Mayfair's dress and, you know, her relationship with Billy Tope. And she also says something about, you know, I've done some things that you probably wouldn't approve of, kind of implying that she has also had to do sex work for survival, similarly to how Tigress did. But the problem is that we could have the idea of his idealized version of Lucy Gray while still seeing that idea break down and seeing how it is unrealistic. We could, as I mentioned, see him start to see flaws in her when he arrives in District 12. And this would be the perfect example of how he was seeing her as idealized when he had something to gain from it, when he had something to gain from selling her to the Capitol, versus in District 12, where he gets to see her as herself and post all that trauma, and suddenly she's not so perfect anymore because he's already ruined her by having her in the games and having her suffer so much in the games. The same thing could be said about the idea of the perfect victim. Even if we wanted to still have her as that perfect victim and show that even though she does everything right, she still gets treated with the violence that Coriolanus gives her, there is a way that we could still see those flaws. Maybe he still sees her as the perfect victim, he still sees her as doing nothing wrong, but we as the audience start to see the flaws in that. As we know, with her putting the snake down Mayfair's dress, she has a tendency to potentially be quite vindictive or angry, and I wish that was something that we got to explore a little bit more, but we don't really get to see her angry. And that would have been a really interesting way to either have us see her as perfect while he starts seeing flaws that aren't there, or vice versa, have him see her as perfect while we start to see the flaws in his idealized version of her that he continues to perpetuate. But we don't do this. It's not executed very well. And I'm sure some of you in the comments will be happy to tell me how wrong I am, and will be happy to tell me about moments in the book that I missed, which show these cracks in this idealized version of her that Coriolanus had. But frankly, I think we could be doing more. Even if there are these small moments, even the moments that I mentioned as being small moments of her not being this like perfect, innocent little flower, there are, you know, we could be doing more. We could be exploring this concept more. The original Hunger Games book were so interesting and dark and complex. And I've seen a lot of people talk about how Sunrise on the Reaping is going to be the darkest Hunger Games movie yet, and people don't know what's coming. And having read that book, I don't think that's true. The original Hunger Games books are so dark and so deep and complex and interesting, with so many layers of themes and analysis that you can do on it, and they got watered down by the films, and I'm starting to see that watering down in these books. The reason that the films fell off was because they went from being these really honest and gritty representations of the books into something that was capitalized, something that was way more interested in making money and making a big cinematic movie than actually exploring any of the really interesting and heavy themes. And we were already seeing that with the first movie because of some of the things they cut out. And I'm starting to see that bleed into the books, because the problem with the commercialization of the films I'm now seeing in The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, in Sunrise on the Reaping. The first Hunger Games series did not feel like a YA novel. It felt like a really interesting analysis. And I've heard some people talk about how Lucy Gray versus Coriolanus are meant to be like two different philosophies, but you can say anything like that. But if you're not backing it up with something really interesting and deep and complex, it just doesn't work. Neither Sunrise on the Reaping nor Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is effective at capturing what the original books did with their complexity. And I'm not just saying that because, you know, it's like a nostalgia thing talking where, oh, they were so much better when I was a kid, blah, 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 blah. These ones feel like YA novels. They feel way more targeted to the audience that exists today. And The Hunger Games at the time was a pioneer of dystopian fiction. You can tell because there have been so many copies and ripoffs of The Hunger Games since. These books Don't do that. And I was suspicious of them when they first came out because to me it was weird that she had waited so long to tell this story. It felt more like she's just trying to make money off of it than it was something that she really wanted to tell. And I still believe that might be true. And it makes me sad because these books could have been great because I know she can do it. The problem that prequels often have is they try to over-explain things. And of course, explaining things that we don't know can be a good way to add complexity. I really liked the inclusion of why roses are important to Snow. But sometimes when we over-explain things in prequels that we already have an explanation for in the originals, it just ends up simplifying them. I've seen some people talk about how it's better to not know if Lucy Gray survives at the end because that's the point. The point is you don't know, and that adds complexity. And they're right. And I think that that is how we should have treated the original Hunger Games books. We don't need to know why mockingjays are a symbol of rebellion because we already have enough of an explanation. We don't need to know who wrote The Hanging Tree to know that it is significant. And we certainly don't need every aspect of the rebellion tied to this one girl who Snow had an obsession with when he was 18 years old. You know, 64 years ago.